My name is Carmi Palafox, an urban planner and economist. Welcome to Beyond Places, the podcast about the planning, design, and leadership of the communities and cities that we call home. I'm truly honored to introduce today's guest. So, he is an internationally acclaimed public artist and landscape architect. After obtaining his degree in landscape architecture at the Ohio State University, he worked for over 10 years in top consultancies such as Blatting Jackson, SOM, and EDSA. As a landscape architect, urban designer, and planner, he has collaborated with architecture's greats such as Bjarke Ingels of Big Architects, Santiago Calatrava, and Zaha Hadid. Despite recognitions such as the Designer Award of Merit by the American Institute of Architects, and being named as one of 7 Faces of Design by the Florida Inside Out Architecture magazine, he pursued his true passion as a public artist. His iconic creations may be found in Miami, San Antonio, London, Abu Dhabi, and Manila. In 2016, he was recognized as Consultant of the Year by the AIA and went on to receive prestigious recognitions such as Up and Coming International Public Artist by the Marlborough Gallery in New York City. Recently, he was honored in his first solo art show at the Orlando Museum of Art in 2021, being the first Filipino to be invited in a USAA museum. He recently won an international design competition to create an icon for the city of Jacksonville in Florida. If you are in the Philippines, you may have seen his colorful creations at SM Aura and his gigantic sculptures along EDSA for Double Dragon and SM Mega Mall. He will be leaving his legacy in the homeland, the Philippines, by creating the tallest icon in Manila, the Victor, which will be the same height as the Statue of Liberty. Welcome, Jefre.
Hi, Carmi. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. So to start off, because some of the people listening and watching may not be familiar with the term public artist, can you describe for us your work as an artist and as a public artist?
Well, I guess the term public artist is best explained by the word itself, public artist. So a lot of artists are more studio artists. So they create art that's really about them, where public art is really about art about the people. A lot of the public art commissions are actually funded by public taxpayer dollars here in the US. And the idea is to create one-of-a-kind public artworks that help identify cities. And so that's what I've been getting into, is this whole idea of public art. As a landscape architect, my past life, I was really about placemaking and understanding of how or where the moments in cities should go. And then I really got interested in just doing the moments.
So you're really passionate about, I think you've been quoted to say, you believe art has the power to put people together, for people to gather, and for them to, I guess, identify with the place.
Yeah, when you, public art here in the States, at least, has just recently caught up. In terms of the value of what it does for cities. In Asia, sometimes, art is already ingrained in our culture, and it's not necessarily, it's always a necessity, versus here, sometimes if we have money left over on projects, then it's incorporated. But, here, the way it's funded is, it's a percent for our program that governments take public facilities such as airports, arenas, universities, and 1% of the capital costs goes to public art. And there's design competitions. And that's where I've, in 2008, when I switched to become a full-time public artist, is the venture I went to. And in my first year, I was a finalist on 12. I won 8 in my first year. And it was an opportunity to kind of take my placemaking processes as a landscape architect and urban designer and actually apply it to art and create not necessarily objects, but structures that tell the meaning and the story and the history of the people that their artwork will occupy. So that was really important to me, to actually create art, not necessarily about me, but about art, about the people.
So, where were your first creations as a public artist?
So my first competition I won was in San Antonio. It was to create an art piece for a public safety headquarters building, which was both police and fire. And I turned it into an opportunity to create an art piece about the people who occupy those buildings, which are those who put their lives on the line, and created sort of this 60-foot beacon sculpture that represents this tower of light, and then the light beam comes out of it into the sky, and to remind people in the city of San Antonio, where are the protectors of the city are. And interesting enough, I actually applied my urban planning skills to it as well, because the sculpture then sits in a grid of the city that's composed into a giant mosaic that represents the city map, where the plaza is, and then honor those who lost their lives by putting their names in the stones that were actually in the light well that shot up in the sky, so that they are all part of the light, to remind people of the ultimate sacrifice they've given for the city. That was one of my first ones that then, won a project in New Orleans, and then won a project in Orlando at the airport, and then decided that my portfolio was building, and started actually getting more direct commissions from developers in cities to do the same thing, which then in 2015 is when I started coming back to the homeland of the Philippines, to applying that same knowledge of public art and the value of public art in cities.
You studied landscape architecture at university. So early on, what brought you to pursue a career in placemaking?
I think, as an Asian descent Filipino, I think I actually started in the medical field. But, like, how am I going to, I've always had a creative industry, part of me, and, obviously your parents want you to succeed. And they said, okay, become an architect or engineer. And, I think I wanted to go more into urban planning and design, because I was really about this idea of community. And I think, landscape architecture and urban design was a way to not necessarily create singular elements, but trying to figure out how all these singular elements can be put together in a creative way, to create a culture that helps identify the people of that city, and that makes it unique. And that's what the business of placemaking is that sense of place, and so I think a lot of urban designers understand that, there's a lot of different systems that make a great city, and I think a lot of that influence has then put myself into the work that I'm doing now as a public artist. But I love landscape architecture. It was, sometimes people, when they say the word landscape, it really has to deal with plants. But for me, it was more than plants. It was really about understanding about systems planning, and how to put these creative pieces together to create a sense of place, and had many opportunities, as you saw in my resume, that to work with sort of the who's who of architects, to kind of work on their unique projects all over the world, which was a great learning and humble experience.
And I'm sure your education and all those years of experience as a landscape architect have a lot to do with who you are now as a public artist.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Ohio State to study urban design and planning, and then I went to the AEA in London for 2 years, the Architecture Association in London, and that's the home of Zaha and a lot of these very contemporary Rem Koolhaas that all went to school there, and so just being in London was just a learning experience on its own, but to able to have the fortune of being able to go to these sort of design focused schools and process making, is really also how I've been able to be successful in sort of my next life as a public artist. So.
And then you had a life-changing event in 2008, and I think that's what triggered for you to pursue your true passion. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you know, you being a urban designer yourself, sometimes you don't have enough time to see some of your visions come to fruition. Sometimes things are 5 to 10 or 20-year master plans, right? And for me, in 2008, my life incident, was the incident where, I had a heart attack at the age of 30. It was in Miami, had triple bypass surgery. And that was when I decided to, quit my job, cash out my 401k, and figure out, how can I create a legacy? And is there a way to be able to leave landmarks in the world? And so that was why, when it was actually the timing when this whole public art program in the US came out. And, I wasn't really a studio artist, so I didn't really have a portfolio. I didn't go through the traditional art route where I was doing art shows and art fairs and going to museums. I went and entered these blind competitions where they don't know who I know or who friends do I know or where I've been or have shown. It was really based on just a pure idea. And so these competitions were very democratic. And I just was in my first year, was fortunate to be a finalist on 12 and when one, not just one, but won 8 in my first year. And I was the fastest public artist to break that, that mark in the first year. And it really had to deal with the fact that I think a lot of artists back then, even now, I mean, it's okay, are very studio based. And so I think, I wasn't a studio artist, which I am now, starting to develop my own style and image and thought process. But I was really, successful from the fact that I was taking my landscape architecture, urban design processes and applying it to creating objects that were more about the people in the city that I'm doing them versus things that I was really about me, So the heart attack in 2008 was really my, kind of my life moment where, I decided that, I want to switch careers and, it was sort of the best thing that could happen to me, which was funny to say. But, I think those kind of pushes, help you motivate you. And, being that young, it allowed me to pivot faster than if it happened to me, later on in my life.
And until now, that experience, the heart attack, which turned out to be a blessing in the end for you, it has inspired a lot of your creations. So if you can talk to us about your first solo exhibit at the Orlando Museum of Art.
Yeah. So, I had an amazing opportunity where, as a lot of my icons in the US were being built, had been featured in the New York Times and other publications, and then been sent back, create more icons in our homeland of the Philippines. That then, I was getting calls to do smaller exhibits. A lot of my work was, 10, 20, 30 meters high, right? So, I didn't have work. So I had to reevaluate, a new series of work that was based on, my inspiration of what a public artist is, and was invited to do a show at the Orlando Museum of Art. And it's interesting because, things, always happen for a reason. I was invited there to do a gallery show, but then because of COVID, some of the artists who were committed for that schedule couldn't make it, or their show couldn't ship, or was stuck in other museum shows because everything was being held. Some museums were open, some were closed. So in some ways, even, now 2022, some art that we're showing now is really from 2020, because of COVID. So the gallery they had 5 galleries that were completely open, and they said, can you fill these up? So I said, sure. And so I made 10,000 square feet of work to cover this first opportunity, which then has now paid off because it's now traveling to different shows now, of which now I'm being shown in LA, in West Hollywood. But the show I showed was a sort of a progression of called Points of Connection, that will share the video and images with you. But it talks my journey as an immigrant, first generation immigrant, that talks about this idea of a journey across the land, across the ocean, about my parents being immigrants from the rice fields and coming here to make a better way of life for us. And then talks about my issues with heart disease, and then public artists. And it's a journey through these 6 rooms that have these poems that are like haikus that talk to you about my journey. And the first sort of major series are these box sculptures, which are very influenced by what I think my urban design practices are. The box series is essentially a series of figures that are all based in staged in emotions, such as figural positions that show love, joy, peace, empowerment. And the heads are boxes, like the word box. But the reason why they're boxes is because they're actually substitutes for buildings. So these are actually buildings on people's bodies. And the idea of what I think make a great city are not necessarily the buildings, but the emotions that create these great cities. So if you put all these figures on a horizon line, you could see I create my own version of a skyline of what makes a great city, which are composed of all these different emotions. And so this opportunity at the museum, which was really amazing, because during COVID, we had 33,900 visitors in the 4 months, ticketed visitors. It was the highest attended show they've ever had in the museum history. Being the first Filipino, there's been Filipino artists that have had exhibited in a museum, with other, group shows or single piece, but it's the first time a Filipino has been granted this large amount of essentially the whole museum to share the work. So it was a great honor for that. But it then got traction to being asked to be shown in a lot of different places, including where we had just had it in a mall, which was a different experience for me, because I wasn't sure how a mall experience would be. But it was even better because we've had almost 70,000 visitors come through there. And I think what I loved about it was I asked that, okay, if we're going to do this, it shouldn't be ticketed. And I bet you 60% of the visitors have never been to an art gallery museum there. And it was a way to kind of give art for free to the people, and so it was an amazing opportunity. And now it's actually in West Hollywood, in LA, and it was an opportunity to share my work there before it actually finally, in the fall of 2020, the show moves to Manila, and it's going to go to the Met Manila in 2022. It'll be my first solo show in the museum in Manila, which will be my first another amazing honor for me to bring my work over there. So
I think that's great that I guess that's, part of your passion as a public artist, just making sure like everyone has access to your beautiful creations. What I found interesting when I saw some videos of your show at the Orlando Museum of Art was how you collaborated with other artists as well. So it wasn't just the visual, but then, it was a full-on sensory experience.
Yeah. So, I think that as a public artist, my work is really about being engaged in the work. It's never about something that you drive by or walk by, but you go to and you're immersed into it. And that's what public art should be, and so I apply that into the experiences in my gallery and museum exhibits where, you are part of the work, whether it's using QR codes and standing under these acrylic heads that play the different languages to kind of remind people of all these powerful words of being loved, empowered, reminding us that we are all these things, but in different languages, to this idea of a sculpture where you scan your eyes and your eyes are actually projected into the sculpture themselves. Because in these last couple of years, we've really never seen each other except through our eyes. But I think what you're referring to is the idea that I've brought in, not only the who's who in technology to kind of understand that, but the idea of sound and sound experience, which I brought in this amazing producer who has won series of Grammy Awards, works with Justin Bieber, and works with Alicia Keys, and works with Cardi B. And it's funny because he's most famous for, he won a Grammy for the WAP song. But and that's like the funny part of it, because a lot of my sponsors are hospital and a religious Advent health. So it's kind of funny. But I think, for him, I think people, I think is interesting because, he's an amazing talent, and he's like, look, I don't, at some point, booty shaking songs are great, but I'd love to like one day do a score to a movie, so I brought him on, and he created the soundscapes for my exhibit that talk about, instead of just the beats that he creates in a club, actually create the beats and the sounds that you would see in a city. And so certain rooms you would hear just traffic noise, or you would hear sirens, or people talking in the alleyways, to hearing my actual heartbeat itself. And I think that being part of these experiences and affecting people differently has been amazing experience of hearing people coming to me and saying how much my exhibit means to them, especially the exhibit that talks about my issues with heart disease, where I show the amount of pills I've taken over the last 10 years, my actual prescription bottles, my stents, the 4 stents that are in my body, displaying them in a case to kind of show people what stents are. And so, public art in cities influence a whole city, but I love the fact that, I'm able to touch people one-on-one when they come through my exhibit. And there's been people that have come crying to me because of, how it reminds them of some of their parents or their friends that have had heart disease, to even someone that was thinking about hurting themselves, and how my exhibit changed them, So I think, like they say, words do matter, but I think having these exhibitions that are inclusive and free for people to experience has been something that's changed my mind in terms of why I do these things, like how these things at a smaller scale can influence people's lives. And it's sometimes I got to really remind myself what I'm doing does influence people, and make sure that what I'm doing is positive, right? So, but it's great. I have one sculpture that is part of the box series that doesn't have a name, because all the names of the sculptures are based on their positions, like love, joy, peace. This one's Untitled, which is the position of someone taking a knee with their hand and fist up in the air, because it references that position here in the States of the Black Lives Matter movement. But what I've allowed people to do is there's a QR code, and you can scan it, and you can actually type in what that position means to you. And you can see the words projected on the wall next to it. And it was really hard to see, where we are in society today, because you'll get things from Black Lives Matter to All Lives Matter, but the things that say, F the police to, the N-word many times. We had to create so many filters, because we had to remind ourselves that, kids are also experiencing this exhibit too. But I think it's sort of the true nature of, where we are as a society today, and to actually see people still typing those things without any regrets is really an interesting kind of exhibit on its own, so.
Yeah. Well, you've been working on some very high profile projects, both in these museum exhibits, but also in your public art. And, some of them get views that people don't, either, because it's art. So either people really like them, or some, people have some very strong views against it. What's your approach in terms of involving people early on and allowing people to express how they feel about your art?
Well, I think it's interesting because, in community planning, as you know, we would do charrettes, but then we also would involve the community, and the community would come in and do these, visual preference exercises, all these surveys. We would generate all of their comments and create, spaces that represent sort of the needs of the community, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas a public artist, I sort of take that same approach, but because of the way the RFPs are issued, it's really hard because it's sort of like, I don't think the organizer goes through the effort as a planner would to then generate the RFP to inform the artists of what the community really wants. And it's really them saying, here is a piece of land, here is our budget, and you come up with an idea, Mm-hmm. And so I've been fortunate enough, and then the stakeholders essentially select that, and hopefully the stakeholders are representative of the community, but sometimes they're not, right? So, I think for me, art is a democracy. I don't think you'll ever make anyone happy, whether it's in public art or community planning or whatever. But my job has never been about pleasing everyone. It's really about having the ability to create a discussion or a dialogue. And the idea of art is a democracy, that, my job is not to tell you to like red or blue. It's really to tell me why you like red or blue, and so, I think that's the value of what good art is it become a discussion point, and if I'm not doing anything that is hurtful, mm-hmm. whether political or religious or sexual, then, for me, I think that's the value of art. I think the hardest thing, though, is, obviously as a public artist, it is very tough to think something new every time. I think if you see my body of work, there's no sort of marquee on it that says, oh, that's a Jefre, besides my new just studio work, because that's what I'm doing is the studio work. But, I think as a public artist, when I go into different cities and create ones of a kind, after a while, ones of a kinds get very challenging. And I've just been fortunate to figure that out. And that is really because of me going through the processes that I do and applied being an urban designer and landscape architect into public art.
So in relation to that, when let's say you're joining a competition, or you've been commissioned to do work in a development or a town, and bringing in your background as a landscape architect and designer, you really work around the local context. So can you take us through, for example, one of your latest projects and how you went through, the research of what really makes this place, and then how your work could embody that or even enhance a characteristic of the community or the place?
Sure. So there's two. One is sometimes I'm involved in a team competition where it's not only the public art piece, but it's part of a sort of a master plan development competition where you're doing not only the master plan, but the architecture and the icon art. And then, which is an example of the competition I won in Jacksonville. And so Jacksonville, Florida is a city on the northeast coast of Florida. It's considered the gateway to the US. It's on the St. Johns River. And the city has been very known as a maritime city with shipping. Actually, it's the largest Filipinos in the city of in the state of Florida, just because of the shipping industry that's there. And for me, the river has always been what I call sort of the keeper of memory. I don't want to sound like a Frozen movie, but the water holds memory, right? And so, the St. John's River really captures, how the skyline of the city has changed over the centuries, right? But the river still stayed the same. And for me, it was really trying to take that river and actually extend it up into the city skyline in terms of a form that looks like three things. One is an anchor, because of them being an anchor to the state of Florida, this idea of love, the love of the city, and this idea of the infinity symbol, that the idea of the river that is going to tell the story forever, right? The story will keep going on forever. And I put these three forms together in this sort of organic shape form that rises from the river, that looks like an anchor, a heart symbol, and an X infinity symbol. But then when you arrange it and look at different ways, it looks like the word love. It looks like I love Jax, which is the short form for Jacksonville. And it actually just looks like the words JAX, So it's interesting because that's been very controversial, because people have been saying it looks like LERP or DERP or Lex or, all these things. So it's been interesting because, what I always say, well, or it looks like sex. I said, so whatever you're saying, it thinks in your mind is what it's going to say. Right. So, for me, it's really about the river, and the story of it in terms of for me, it's really about everything has a detail and meaning. So the total height of it is 151 feet, which translates to inches, to 1822, when the city of Jacksonville was founded. The length of the whole sculpture is 310 feet, which represents in nautical miles of the length of the St. John's River. So that was really hard to do, but I got it to work. But things like that, in terms of meaning and purpose, all go back to this idea of context and research about creating sculptures that are not only aesthetically pleasing, I guess that's subjective, iconic, but then also has a meaning when you dive into it. And the polished mirror stainless is very reflective of the river itself, and you being part of that reflection, and you being part of that history of changing and evolving the city is the beauty, of that sculpture. So the team idea, where I'll tell you, is that there's two controversies. One is, whether people loved it or not, but it was part of a master plan development RFP competition where there was sort of four categories, where category one was urban design, category two was landscape architecture, three was architecture for the hotel, and fourth was the icon. And I was on the Perkins and Will team, which is a giant architecture firm, going up against a Boston team and a New York team, so we were going up against sort of these who's. And each category was 25 points, and the selection committee was live. So you can actually see how they were scoring you based on the committee putting the scores in. So we were all, in category one, first team would get, 20 points, we would get 19, and then someone would get 18. And then the second one was like, 15, 14, 12, and then 16, 15. And we're like, oh my God, we're three points behind. We were never on top. Like, how are we going to make it up? In the final category for the art, we got 20 points. The next team got 10.
Wow.
And it was actually what won us the competition. And even in the committee, they said, with the inclusion of the iconic sculpture, it's what put the Perkins and Will over the top to win it. And the interesting thing is, they signed a really nice large fee, and I still have to fundraise for the art piece. And I'm like, you guys owe me, It's like, but I think that's the value of what art is that I think it's everything needs to work together, but I think the idea that the icon art will help put City of Jacksonville on the map, similar to when you say things like the arch or the Eiffel Tower, the Statue of Liberty, or even the Bean, I think you know what cities these are.
Yes.
And when you say the Jacks, then people will know where this is, so hopefully.
Well, from what I've read, one reason as well why it's been quite controversial was the cost of it. But then, you have these views that public art could be seen as an expense. I mean, earlier in the interview, you were saying how for a lot of cities or developments, they put a very minimal fee, if at all, for art. But then there are instances that we see, for example, I remember when I went to the High Line the first time, there was a concern about how it was seen as an expense, but then in the end, it actually brought a lot of value to the community. Have you seen the same, be it for the Jacks project or another, wherein you actually brought value to the place rather than adding cost, so to speak?
Well, it's funny because the High Line is only literally like 50 feet of an old abandoned rail yard that goes through through New York, and the property values before it was redeveloped were probably the lowest, and now that it's up, it's like now everyone wants High Line views, right? And people are building towers on High Line, so you see the value of what open space has done, similar to Central Park, but that's the same thing can occur also with icons. So once again, when I say the Eiffel Tower and Arc de Triomphe and all that stuff, and the arch, Jesus the Redeemer, if you look, the real estate value around those things are the highest, because of the fact that people want not only views of Central Park, if they don't have that space and they have a view of an icon, it has the similar vein. So my work as a public artist has to deal of creating icons is based on 3 to 4 assumptions. It has to be the postcard to your city. It has to be selfie or Instagram worthy, because that's the culture we're in now. I mean, even back then, we'd want to go take a photo in front of a beautiful, a tree or fountain. And now everyone's Googling, where do we go for the Instagram photos? Where are the things that are these photos? The third one is that the icon will generate people traffic, which then means, most importantly, that generates buying power. That with the Jack sculpture, I was saying, look, I don't care if you say lerp, derp, lex, love, as long as you come down, take a selfie, buy a beer, have dinner, have lunch. That's all I care, And I think that if you build it, they will come, not only necessarily means people, but brands and businesses that want to capitalize off, the number of people that will be coming to this area, so that they can sort of use that opportunity to, help create their own businesses, So I don't know if people realize, the Bean in Chicago, are known as Cloud Gate, by Anish Kapoor, was $25 million. And people are like, I actually kind of know how much it is. So he did make some money off it, a lot of money, but it paid itself back in 5 years from the fact that all the businesses around it raised in real estate value. But then the biggest thing, which then opened everyone's eyes, is that brands started coming to the park. So if you go to the Cloud Gate or the Bean, you'll actually see in partnership with AT&T. So AT&T, just like any corporation that you would see, has recognized, hey, we want our name on this. They'll pay, 6 figures or whatever they do in terms of like they do on a building, and do it on art, and actually now in public space. So even in there, the Paseo or the walkway is named after Boeing in Millennium Park. The bike pavilion is named after McDonald's. Like you see that, once they build it, they all start. Now that model is really hard to copy, but I think, that is the nexus, is that sort of icon. And if that wasn't there, then no one's going to come in and put their name on a bike pavilion, right? So the Jacksonville thing has many opportunities where, it's going to is starting to generate a lot of buzz in terms of we're talking with several businesses to buy the naming rights for the sculpture. And then also now developers around it of the empty parcels are now looking at the fact that this is going there, and now they want to have a hotel or rechange their thinking on the types of restaurants they want there, instead of fast casual, actually doing more fine dining and higher end things, just because of the amount of traffic the sculpture will generate, and so which is very similar to now, in terms of the giant icons that I'm doing in the Philippines.
Yes. If we can talk about that as well. So it's interesting how you haven't been to the Philippines because of travel restrictions in, is it 2 years or more? And yet your biggest iconic figures are there now. So would you like to talk about firstly time?
Yeah. So I think that before COVID, there was some things that are out, there's takes time for design, right? But I think when they got finally realized, they were during COVID and when they were finished. So there was, I've had a couple, my first series of sculptures were at SM Aura, with these giant animal sculptures that are on the roof and different decks. And then this opportunity with SM to where they had asked me to create, or they actually saw my show and they were like, we want one of yours, and it was, and I was like, I think that was an opportunity for me to say, look, the context of the area, I don't have to do something that was really about the people. But then the interesting thing is it was a studio work, which was the Time box series sculpture, but the one that they picked was really very coincidence about what the family values in terms of the C family, which this idea of time and the value of time. So that bringing a figure sculpture that had someone looking at his watch over EDSA traffic every day really reminds us of the value of time. I think me coming to the Philippines really made me realize that I don't know if people are always late or it's just too much traffic, and that's where the Filipino time, it sort of came up. But I think, having this giant sculpture reflecting in the landscape of people walking by, and actually the interesting is like there's video of the head of the sculpture showing the traffic being reflected in the sculpture themselves, was an amazing opportunity that the SM family had given me. And then that was just dedicated this last December. And then this past January, my other two new sculptures were dedicated over in Double Dragon on EDSA close to MOA. And that was really more of a site-specific artwork that was 15 meters tall. And there's two sculptures, one that's standing next to the building, like 9 stories tall, and then one on top of the building. And it's called Bayani and Pagasa, which is hero and hope. I got that right?
Yes. Bayani is hero, Pagasa is hope. Yes.
And this was really about, not necessarily that we don't have to do any more monuments to our leaders, but let's talk about creating icons and sculptures that reflect to the future, which is our youth. And those two sculptures really identify the youth of the Philippines and even the area. And there are two positions where the heads are shaped like globes. The idea that we're a global Filipino, and then the idea of the headpiece or headsets that you see on them, because us and India are the number one call service or service provider in the world, right? And
Yes.
you always hear that voice of the Filipino worldwide, helping people, right? And so I just wanted to give homage to an industry that sometimes we neglect or forget, which is that sort of BPO sector, So I think it was an opportunity to do that. And then my largest sculpture now, which is there, but still getting assembled, will be for Robinson Land in a development called Bridgetown, which is close to C5 in Ortigas, which will be 55 meters tall, 24 stories tall. Will be same height as the Statue of Liberty without the pedestal. But that was important for me to be reflective of one-to-one in a position with a hand up in the air, to kind of show that we are global, and to kind of connect, that we can connect to other parts of the world. So we don't have a torch hanging in the air, but we have our hand in the air, kind of reminding people that we're here to always help, and be part of your life, no matter what we need, what service you need. But we are here to help, but then we're also powerful in our own rights. And it's a perforated figurative sculpture that will have 40 to 50 projectors, and it'll be the largest projection mapping sculpture in the world. That's not, obviously the Burj Khalifa, but of a sculpture that will be on the Marikina River, and that will also be able to be seen, from all parts of Manila. So I think that was a very amazing opportunity. And I think, if anything, what I've been able to figure out is to educate the business leaders of the Philippines to invest and open their pocketbooks, which sometimes I hear is hard to do, and invest in art, and I think they see that. But also they see the opportunity very similar to what I've done in Jacksonville, is now that, with these icons, especially the Victor, they're starting to land things like Hong Kong land and other opportunities, and condo projects that all want views of Victor, and even in their advertisement, they show the Victor as part of it, because they all want to be part of that asset, so you can only design so many Bellagio fountains, right? So I think they, definitely these things that are iconic in nature and defining cities are really paying themselves back on their own, right? And as a tourista, obviously, any expat or Phil Am's coming, they're going to want to see this sculpture. So I've been honored to be able to do something or be part of this amazing project.
These sculptures are massive, and from what I've seen in photos, they look really beautiful. So I can just imagine how long it took them. So especially with times now that you have to manage the whole project remotely, and just having the scale of these sculptures being so big, how do you go about with coordinating a team, with manufacturing the pieces, transporting them as well? And, for those of us who are from the Philippines, making sure the structures can withstand, typhoons, super typhoons, earthquakes and whatnot, floods.
Mm-hmm. So great question. The way I describe it is, I'm essentially a design build contractor. I go from design to engineering to fabrication to transportation to installation. It allows me to control every part of the process, versus designing it and subbing it out. Actually, the lesson learned was my first project in the Philippines. I don't tell this people quite often, but the SM sculptures at Aura are actually take two. Take one was actually done locally, and they fell down. They didn't follow my design, didn't follow engineering. So take two, I said, I'm not doing this unless we do it ourselves. And now it's been up for the last 4 or 5 years through several typhoons and conditions. So everything we do, especially at a scale we do, goes through as if we're almost designing a building. My process does start conceptually with clay modeling, computer modeling, CNC cutting, 3D printing, all that kind of stuff. And then we will work with a structural engineer, similar to what we would do with a building, even working with someone like Arab,
Mm-hmm.
Who are design towers. So at some point, you are designing a building, we can't just work with fabricators and the old artist method and just say, no, don't worry, we make it strong enough. We actually, especially here in the US, have to work on calculations, wind load calculations, seismic calculations. I mean, we've got documents of every single torque or wind load on every single part, weld tests. I mean, that we have to get inspected. I mean, just from the fact that, not only from a professional liability standpoint, but the fact that here in the US, we're definitely much more legal in terms of attorneys, and people like to sue everyone. But, we go through a really hard permitting process. And I actually opened some cities' eyes because it's actually my fault. And I actually hated this last sculpture I did here in the US because they made me do every single calculation, which cost a lot of money. I actually think if there was a typhoon or hurricane, I think the building, they would be the only thing that'd be standing. So, but I think that's why when we do projects, sometimes, as there's things in there that cost more that you don't even see, that's underground in the footer or the main structure, and the skin itself is the cheapest thing, right? Mm-hmm. But before COVID, back to your question, I was actually fortunate to find a team that I trusted in all aspects of the project, where I was starting to understand how to weld and polish. And obviously with the scale I'm doing, I mean, I wouldn't be talking to you now, I'd be in the corner welding all day, So obviously it's, having a good team to understand everything. That's why I always say, I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know. And then when I work on a project, I showed you that slide before of an Avengers team of finding the best of all things, just very similar to my museum exhibit, to make that overall experience much better, right? Mm-hmm. But Zoom has actually allowed me to reassess how I do things, from the fact that if I have a trusted team and I could see things virtually, why do I have to get on a 20, 30-hour flight every single month before COVID, which is what I was doing, coming to Asia and China every month. I think there's times I think you thought I lived there already because you see I'm there all the time, right? But I think the best thing for me is that, when developers in cities meet me and they see me as this label artist, that after working with me, they don't realize, I don't ever tell them I have a background in urban design and landscape architecture or architecture. They realize that, that's the education I do give to other artists, is that you can be as creative as you want, but you've got to understand budget, schedule, engineering. You can't just be this crazy artist with ideas. Like, you're never going to be believable. And I think the best thing is that, I've been able to take the skills of being pragmatic and kind of a project manager in landscape architecture and apply that to art, mm-hmm. which is something that is hard to teach to artists. I guess they don't teach that, right? So that was the thing that for me, in terms of how I manage these big projects, is really being able to find the best of their crafts, especially when it deals with engineering, so that anything I do create is going to be a legacy landmark there, not just for 1 year, but hopefully 2-3 centuries,
So earlier on, I introduced you as a public artist because I kept hesitating, because you do so much more than, quote unquote public art. You've created the crown for the Miss World pageant. You've also been working with Virgin on a music festival. How do you choose, or is it more of, do you see it as an advocacy of, trying to maybe communicate with other industries and sectors to create this awareness of creating beautiful places as well, because they know, oh, the artist who did this also did this sculpture in the city or in this town?
I think that I think it's the world is changing, as you know. I think, we're all designers, right? I mean, you're a designer, right, Carmi? I think we're all designers, and I think the problem is sometimes when we go through education, the system makes us check a box, you know. And then when you graduate, they make you get a title. And then when you get a license, your license says that title, right? And sometimes, you know, in the Philippines, that's, you know, it's really a pride thing, because I think the best thing that people can afford there is this idea of education, right? And that's why when I was finally coming home, they would introduce me to folks like yourself, not by, hey, this is Carmi. They say, this is architect Carmi. This is engineer Joe. This is attorney Santos. This is, usually it's just doctor something, but I've never heard like, you know,
even now there's a environmental planner, master plumber.
Yeah. Like the title, like the where your craft is just sort of a pride thing, which is great, you know. And so, you know, back to this idea, like how do we get those titles away from us, and the fact that we're just all creatives is what now brands are looking at. And so when I get approached by these brands, you know, such as Miss World, and it wasn't even Miss World Philippines, it was Miss World USA, you know, that, you know, they were interested in, as an artist, how would I take that process in crown making, you know, versus a jeweler who just kind of does things that are based on structure, that hold jewels, that make their version of aesthetic based on histories of crown making, right? So for me, you know, I looked at the idea of, you know, what is Miss World and its idea of a globe. And I essentially got a globe and looked at the hemispheres of these sort of pie-shaped pieces from the globe that make that circle, and started peeling them off. And I was like, you know, these latitudes and longitudes, you know, really go around the curvature of the earth. So I made a structure of these series of these, you know, these little shapes that then were all the gems would be part of the idea that the globe was unwrapped and then was full of these diamond shapes. So there was a reason for being, which they never had before, in terms of just someone saying, oh, I just made a beautiful crown because I think it looked this, you know. So everything I did was essentially you know, dissected in terms of, you know, the processes that, you know, I learned as a placemaker of a city, and how do I apply it to objects. And, you know, and then someone like Virgin, you know, I think, you know, God rest his soul, but I had an opportunity to meet Virgil Abloh, who was the lead designer for Louis Vuitton, that passed away this past year. And met him almost 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, when he was but he was a stylist and a DJ for Kanye, you know, and starting to get into the art world. You know, that was really interested in the street scene. And for someone like Louis Vuitton, that had, you know, that very, you know, prestige brand, to bring in someone with street culture and integrate that street brand and this idea of art aesthetic. And Virgil was actually went to the, you know, the IIT, studied architecture in Chicago, who actually graduated in architecture, right?
Wow.
To become the lead fashion designer for the, you know, one of the most premier brands is never unheard of, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, that is actually, you know, hopefully something that brands are starting to see and starting to approach me on, you know, which has been an honor. You know, like I didn't, you know, Virgil didn't go to, you know, like I would love to design a collab with a fashion brand one day, you know. But Virgin approached me. They were doing a music festival. There was talks about me doing an art piece for Coachella. I started winning all these competitions and these installations, and Virgin was like, we want to compete with Coachella because, you know, why do we have to bring different acts when we have tons of acts under the Virgin label, you know, like Lizzo and all these stuff. We want to have our own music festival with our own acts. So they incorporated me in terms of the design process, asked me to come up with different ideas. And this would have been last year at the LA Coliseum. And I had designed these amazing sort of all-inclusive astronauts, because this idea that, you know, we're sending everyone to space now. It's no longer, there's no mold for what an astronaut looks like. And I created 3 or 4 different molds of a small, medium, and large astronaut, of all different body types. And we would have had 70 of these going through the fairgrounds with these giant umbrellas that act as shade structures. And they almost are called meteor showers. So the idea that, they're getting protected, using the umbrella for that. So it's the irony of that. And then the interesting one was, as part of the festival, was me creating some ideas for the acts to come off on the stage, so getting into actual stage design, which is, an amazing opportunity as well. So, it's interesting where, the word artist is funny because, when you say landscape or architect or planner, there's like you get thrown in these boxes. But if you're an artist, then you essentially, it's funny, as a landscape architect, I was doing things that were too crazy to clients. But these same clients, if I came in with the word artist, I wasn't doing things that were crazy enough. So
it's okay to be crazy.
Yeah.
Get as crazy as you want.
Yeah. So I think, these opportunities for, if you look at other people in our genres or sort of our mentors, like, Michael Graves, or Frank Gehry, or even someone like Philippe Stark, right? Where, they're not only doing buildings, but doing furniture design. And Michael Graves, who here in the States, I remember when he had a whole line of kitchen stuff at Target, to Frank Gehry, who does all the crazy metal buildings, to his series of stuff he did with Louis Vuitton, right? So, maybe, I think, these guys are creating iconic buildings, and maybe as I move to creating iconic icons or monuments, that maybe I'll get opportunities to do collabs with these folks. But I'm just kind of allowing the path to kind of happen on its own, right? And I think media finds people who are doing interesting work. One of the biggest ones that I was, sometimes you don't even know it myself, when I was taking Philippine Airlines, I saw on the Mabuhay magazine the cover of one of my sculptures for the Carabao at Zamora. And I was like, oh, they didn't even call me or anything. It was just there. And, airlines magazines, when I call them, they're like, yeah, we look at analytics and look at the things that are most visited or hashtag on social media. And that was one of them.
Wow.
And so I think that's how people, and media recognize, what our places or people go to based on, analytics of social media. So
perhaps my last question, Jeffrey, because you've worn very interesting hats as artist, as landscape architect, or even if we do away and literally hats, yeah. What would you like to see more of in places, be it in the Philippines or in the US, now or when we come out of this pandemic?
I think the interesting thing is, going full circle, landscape architecture, sometimes we tend not to invest in the outdoor space, where sometimes in landscape, in building projects, as you know, is that if we have any money left over, let's do some gardens or something. Or even if, and then the opposite of that is if we were running out of money, the first thing the VE or value engineer was landscape, right? With COVID, we've learned this whole thing about 6 feet apart, but also everyone enjoys outside. Everyone has been turning parking lots and parking stalls into outdoor dining. Everyone's been turning, these gravel lots into, outdoor living rooms. I think the roofs have been changed to, becoming more plazas outside. And that was only from the fact that, we were mandated to be COVID free or have vaccination. Even now, like, you need a vaccination card to go inside the restaurant, but you could sit outside if you don't have a vaccination card. So I think the push to develop outdoor spaces is really something that I think I'd like to see more, because now, as you can tell, I don't think it's just COVID, but other things coming on. I think the value of outdoor space, especially Manila, there's not a lot of outdoor space. We're so, your parks are the malls, and that's why the malls are so busy, because it becomes their public space, right? It's just because land is running out. I think it was funny because I would go to parts of BGC and I'd be like, oh, this is a nice, beautiful green lot. Like, no, it's a building pad for, it'll be gone soon, right? But I think people are now valuing the outdoor, and I think I like to see more and more of that. And that goes back to city planning too. And, maybe there's a guide there of, how much commitment that developers have to do in terms of open space, and doing that, or getting GFA or FAR credit, or doing something so that, people can actually enjoy the outdoors now. Because I think, to be honest, this will be the new normal,
Yes. Well, I hope, it's not just the private sector, but also the public sector.
Mhm.
If, governments also are strict with one, identifying public open spaces and making sure they remain public and open.
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed speaking with you, Jeffrey. I think this is the longest chat so far I've had in this podcast.
Sorry, did I bore you? Did I?
Not at all. If only we could keep going on. Thank you so much for your time. And, I'm very proud of everything that you're doing. I'm sure your whole family is proud of you as well, with all the works that you're doing in the homeland and around the world.
No,
So thank you.
No, thank you. Actually, to close on that, it's funny because, as a artist, I have that artist named Jefre, right? But when I started doing work in the Philippines and getting more noted, my parents were like, please, anak, your name is Jefre Figueras Manuel. Please remind people that where you are. So yeah, they're definitely very proud of me. They've given me so much. My mother came to my exhibit in LA. It was the first time she saw my exhibit. She's when I first saw her, she cried. I was like, I never seen her cry. And so I think it was an amazing opportunity to see how much I've influenced them as well. But then I also want to thank you, Carmi, because I don't know if people really know, but when I was actually an urban designer and planner, my first job, one of my first projects was with the Lopez family. And I had met your father, Mr. Palafox, on working on that development in Rockwell. And so it's interesting how, I don't know, 20 years, we're getting old, right? I mean, years later, that, I still know that I'm still in touch with the Palafox family.
Was this when you were with SOM or?
SOM, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. And you guys were the local for that project, so I think sometimes things come to full circle, and I've appreciated everything you've done for me since I've been coming back to the Philippines, and you and your family have been a big legacy in terms of planning and placemaking, in terms of how the city of the Philippines has worked. So
thank you, Jeffrey. I'm really excited to see your work when we are able to travel, or I look forward to seeing your work in Australia sometime soon.
Yes, I'd love to come down there. So
okay.
But thanks for your time. Appreciate everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Beyond Places. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to connect with me on social media and carmipalafox@gmail.com. If you enjoy this podcast, please do subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Bye and see you again next week.